Shelter City. Hello everybody. We are Anca, Rusu and Cristina Enache, architects, doctors in architecture and urbanism, and professors at the Mincu University. Together we will present our study on the latest events facing our country related to the challenge of finding urban architectural elements and functional solutions and resources to help Ukrainian refugees. This study is an open paper, and we will continue to analyze the necessity of the cities to build a new type of infrastructure. The aim of the paper. This paper aims to analyze the situation that Romania is facing in the last month regarding the reception of Ukrainian refugees. The absence of an adequate, adaptive and flexible infrastructure, strategically designed, safe and well-equipped, raised question about the ability of the Romanian cities to respond to crises or emergency situations. The study prepares the outline framework for planning and designing urban infrastructure for this situation in order to consolidate the urban organism, its equilibrium and its adaptive qualities. So we are here. The reality that invades us, unpredictable and until yesterday seemingly improbable, proves that history continues to be written according to the same rules that seemed obsolete. From an anthropological point of view, looking at our lives, the pursuit of resources together with the lack of empathy and education is a generating mixture for conflicts. The consequences of the immediate war neighborhood are being felt more and more strongly in the urban environment through the influx of refugees who need shelter. However, some of Romanian cities should soon solve the excess of existing shelter capacity. Initiating a strategy to establish the optimal process for shaping new poles dedicated to the construction of shelters will be able to prevent a possible major imbalance at urban, social and economic level. The discussion. The paper aims to formulate criteria for the integration within a city of optimal locations for temporary shelters for refugees, as well as the necessary stages of preparing the population for acceptance and involvement. The originality of the study is due, on the one hand, to the previously unaddressed topic due to the unique moment we are in, end of the pandemic, beginning of the war, and on the other hand, to the identified social peculiarities. Introduction and the argumentation of the subject. A brief presentation of the situation Romania is facing in the last month as a result of the reception of Ukrainian refugees reveals the need to build an urban strategy for sheltering refugees, to estimate the essential needs, as well to reduce the risk of imbalance in the functioning of the urban organism. During this period, Romania is facing the immediate vicinity of the war generated by the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. The felt effects beyond the political level deeply affect emotionally the society, an effect which is easily visible through the mobilization in the issue of helping the refugees, a situation that appeared immediately after the attack of Ukraine by Russia. The reception of refugees has demonstrated previously unidentified needs, or sometimes identified and ignored, the lack of programs or infrastructure to ensure their takeover, guidance and shelter. The requests that the urban organism must respond to, as well as the way in which these cities can prepare for this situation, are the main subject of this paper. The theme of shelters has been studied before more in terms of natural disasters. Most of the refugees were in transit, and by the end of the war we are expecting new waves of refugees. If the first to pass were people who belonged to the middle class with material possibilities and no major traumas, the data on the ground shows that as the war continues, we expect refugees to come without material possibilities and with major traumas. The context. Obviously, Romania's geographical position makes it indirectly involved in the recent events from the immediate vicinity. The border with Russia, the Black Sea, Crimea, the borders of the EU and NATO contribute in generating a zone of tension in which our country is located due to the expansionist external tendencies and the lack of dialogue. The outbreak of war in Europe is undoubtedly one of the biggest shocks of the last 20 years. The aggressiveness of the event has created one of the largest humanitarian crises in recent European history. The bombings, the attitude of the Russian army, the violence forced a large part of the Ukrainian population to take the decision to leave the country and determined an unprecedented solidarity, especially at the level of civil society, regarding the reception of refugees. At the level of civil society, the mobilization was exemplary, despite rather cold ties, old animosities smoldering between neighbors, and older diplomatic scandals related to the treatment of minorities. It is possible that the link was the collective memory of the atrocities committed by the aggressor and the proximity of the conflict, but certainly also the humanitarian education. According to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees report from February 2022, to the present date, an estimated 4 million people have fled Ukraine to the neighboring countries, of which about 600,000 refugees have entered Romania, about 4,500 people requesting asylum. The European context. The Europe map offers rare case studies for shelters, no matter the reason: natural disasters, conflict, violence, or others. Obviously, Europe was taken by surprise by this war. The issue of sheltering arises and gives birth to the need of design and think at another type of urban infrastructure. The urban preparation of cities for sheltering war refugees. The issue of shelters for war refugees could be viewed from several perspectives. The first would be that Bucharest is far from having enough civilian shelters. Thus, the shelters are insufficient and, unfortunately, mostly impractical due to the lack of maintenance of air intakes, sanitary installations, and floods in the basements. The newly designed shelters should be located in areas where they can be accessed and used by city residents after they are released by the wave of refugees. Bucharest is a city that had suffered through history a series of significant natural disasters. If the floods caused by Dâmbovița no longer present any danger following the regularization of the riverbed completed in 1998, the imminence of earthquakes remained present, Bucharest having over 2,000 buildings in danger of collapse. The role of architect would be primarily to centralize this data and to identify places that could meet the optimal criteria for the location of shelters. Obviously, open public areas seem to be the easiest option to access in an emergency. However, they must not eliminate an in-depth study that will prepare the city for emergencies in the future. The examples. The case studies reveals that, unlike the refugee acceptance by the community, which was generally very good, most of the weaknesses reported were related to the project itself. These include lack of repairs and maintenance, lack of awareness of wider needs, lack of verification procedures, lack of financial support measures, and implementation of a large housing project without a pilot construction. Lack of time for proper implementation, delayed decisions by local authorities, lack of understanding of how household works were the main problems that were reported. The study tries to identify criteria for designing an urban shelter system, a spatial network able to respond to different challenges in cases of emergency, risks, disasters. Firstly, we define the main criteria like location, neighborhood, functional, architectural, social, and economical. The shelters must be easily accessible, roads and pedestrian, related to the main national and international transport points, and the land areas big enough to support new structures. It is very important to be friendly in terms of design and atmosphere, smart and easy to understand regarding the spatial organization. These structures should be flexible and modular, possible to extend and with easy assembly. Secondly, we should take into consideration the impact of the urban and social context, like the possibility of the congestion of traffic, of additional loading of public transport, the necessity of an increased control of public safety, and the reactions of the resident population. The shelters, an architectural language. Humanity, unlike other life forms on Earth, regards housing as having many values, namely as a shelter resistant to weather, fire, natural challenges or conflicts, but also having an important aesthetic load. Things created by man become important to him when they have been invested with certain meanings beyond the role of tool. Thus, human shelters must meet the most of users' needs, whether they are used in the long or short term. The man will appreciate the feeling of security that a solid shelter gives him, but he will always feel the acute need for it to satisfy his aesthetic sense. Obviously, emergency shelters must respond primarily to the human requirement to have a roof over the head. That's why we can start, as some of the projects presented here suggest, with a roof, but the aesthetic side should not be ignored. The aesthetic side is what gives meaning to the shelter and contributes significantly to increasing the feeling of well-being. Conclusions. The question is whether or not the metropolitan area of Bucharest is ready to respond to the current moment. We can see now that the city needs a responsive system for risk situations or disasters, capable to respond to a variety of unforeseen events, war, natural disasters, pandemics. Structures built on a temporary or permanent basis, which have the capacity to be easily transformed and used. It is interesting that the infrastructure built during the pandemic was useful in the first phase of the events of the last month. There are a few projects that have shown that architecture can simultaneously help rebuild communities and lives. It is the moral and deontological obligation of architects to provide shelter that respects the human dignity of communities in difficult situations. Architecture schools could be involved in this process, giving students the opportunity to design shelters. It would be a big step forward in their education as future architects, bringing to the fore the fact that people need decent shelters, especially when fleeing conflict or calamity areas. Rediscovering the feeling of home, even if it's temporary, is essential for people and for their quality of life. Initiative groups that help refugees and have mobilized spontaneously long before state institutions may not know what the definition of home can bring to a space. Emergency architecture should work directly for communities in extreme situations, use easily accessible local materials, and implement fast-paced techniques that only they know. In the very near futures, planners can find better solutions for organizing. They can design revolutionary technological and energy-saver shelter projects at low prices, easy to assemble. Architecture and urbanism can simultaneously help rebuild lives, buildings, and communities. Thank you for your attention.